Just a note before we start. Our show talks about touchy subjects that may be difficult for some of our listeners. Take care of yourself. If you feel you need to seek help, see the links at the end of our show notes for resources.
Hey y'all, and welcome to Touchy Subjects Podcast, the podcast that aims to break the silence that tends to come with conversations around domestic and sexual violence. I'm Sean.
And I'm Amanda.
And today we are going to be discussing cultural scripts with our special guest, Aubrey Aust. So thank you for joining us today, Aubrey.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, we are really excited to have you on the podcast. We had a great conversation prior to getting you on today, so we are so excited to have our audience be able to hear all of your wonderful information that you have to provide us. But before we jump in, would you like to introduce yourself to our audience?
Absolutely, I'd love to. My name is Aubrey Aust. I am a writer and educator and currently a master's candidate at NYU, where I study relational psychology and philosophy. So the core question of all of my research is on what allows us to feel safe in relationships. And I approach this through a lot of lenses. I'm looking at attachment theory, somatic psychology, trauma studies, and relational ethics, and incorporating all of those into an educational script. So my background is actually in political theory, which will become very relevant in this conversation. I was really obsessed with questions of power and structure and how desire and who is allowed to feel safe gets shaped by systems. So that's kind of my origin story. I studied a lot of thinkers like Foucault and Hannah Arendt, and began noticing that what we often frame as personal, as who we love, what we long for, how we hurt, there's also a political component to that and societal. So my thesis work and my current work today brings all of that together. I'm really exploring how these cultural scripts, especially those around gender, sexuality, they essentially govern who is allowed to hurt, who is allowed to heal, and ultimately whose pain gets either validated or ignored. So what I bring to this conversation, it's not just theory. There's also largely a deep listening component to this, but I'm very interested in how people are reclaiming agency, especially after rupture or harm, and how when we rewrite these scripts, either if it's a script on intimacy, on gender, on even on healing, can actually transform our relationships and hopefully our culture itself.
And if all of that sounds super intimidating to you as our listeners, don't worry, because we are going to break it on down for you into some very understandable parts, and you're going to be able to follow. Don't worry.
Don't worry. Yeah, this is why I do what I do, because at a high level, it sounds scary. It sounds very scary to me. And so I'm like, can we please break this down on a fundamental level of human understanding so we can have these conversations?
Yeah,
Well,
if we hadn't had the conversation beforehand and I just heard that, I would have been like,
Terrified.
this is way beyond what I can comprehend.
I'm friendly, I promise.
Aubrey is way smarter than us.
Way smarter.
So really kind of jumping into the discussion, because cultural scripts might be something that a lot of our listeners might not even be familiar with that phrasing, or if they are, they're familiar with it really in the confines of typical conversations around like gender roles, essentially. So really, when you talk about cultural scripts, what do you mean by that?
Yeah. Cultural scripts are essentially the rules that we have inherited. And so whether we are aware of them or not, they play out in our day to day. So it's rules that we are kind of internalizing around how we behave, how we feel, and how we relate. And you are absolutely correct in bringing up how it often is applied to gender, but it can also be applied to power and intimacy. And they're not just ideas, they're things we've all internalized because we live in a society. So they're things that we have internalized even on a somatic level. That means how it just shows up in our bodies, in how we breathe, how we touch, how we learn to regulate ourselves in moments of closeness or conflict. So, for example, if we do break it down, just gender-wise, you large umbrellas here, but men are often given scripts that encourage either dominance or emotional suppression or stoicism, whereas women, on the other hand, are often scripted into more patterns of accommodation, on nurturing and being non-confrontational. So these scripts, they dictate not just how we are allowed to act, but they also play into how we are allowed to be hurt or to heal. And a lot of it comes into who gets to be believed, who's expected to be strong, who's allowed to fall apart in circumstances, and who's offered empathy. And so, because these are so deeply ingrained, we often live them out without realizing it. So, one of the first steps toward healing is developing awareness, just simply acknowledging that these scripts are here and asking ourselves, whose script am I following? And is this actually mine?
This is something that we've talked about before in ways where it's come to like when you talk about like who will be believed. We've
Mm-hmm.
talked about who those like quote unquote perfect victims are,
Yeah.
right? If you're somebody that follows that cultural script, if you are the way society expects you to be and behave, then you're more likely to be believed as a survivor or as anything. Um, but that doesn't mean that other people shouldn't be believed just because they don't tend to follow that script. So I think this is going to be a great conversation to get us into just knowing the differences out there between what's expected of us, what we actually portray, and how that affects our day-to-day lives.
Mm-hmm. For sure.
And what I like about the framing of like the cultural scripts too is it really plays into a lot of like the discussions that Amanda and I often have about messaging in media too. So like trying to recognize what messaging that you're getting in the media that you're consuming, because when you take in that messaging enough, that might start to then dictate how you're interacting on the world around you, which means you're then following the script that is being given. Like as a man, using that example again, if I watch a bunch of superhero movies all the time, I am constantly seeing men in roles of being protectors and being strong. So I may eventually believe that that is my role. So I am going to start trying to play out and follow that script because that is what I believe it means for me in this moment to be a man.
Exactly. Yeah. And that comes in so much in our day to day. Simply exactly what you said, because of media messaging, because of the messages we're internalizing. And so these scripts, they not only shape how we experience harm, but also how that harm is received by others. And the aspects of survivorship that are gendered, racialized, classed. And I think you said it perfectly about speaking about that perfect victim trope and how that image is not neutral, right? It's something that we've constructed socially. And so people who don't necessarily fit into that mold, whether it's a trans person, a man, a black woman, they're often met with doubt or dismissal or even blame when they disclose harm. And
Yeah.
so this is creating a secondary wound simply within that cultural script, because the harm isn't just what happened, it's also the fact that no one believed them and that they weren't seen. And so this is what I'm studying, this relational trauma, the harm that occurs not only through the act itself, but through the rupture of trust and misattunement afterwards. And this is so important to be having this conversation, because healing from that requires not just acknowledgement. Of course, of course it requires acknowledgement of the event and processing that, but there's also a huge aspect of cultural change that just includes looping people in on the conversation.
Mm-hmm. And I think that's really the like, and kind of like the linchpin in this is like you mentioned, these are developed socially. We as a society have written these scripts, whether we know it or not. We have written them. So if we want to see that change, where it's we're not harming victims because they don't look like a perfect victim, we're not forcing men and women to follow a specific path, we're not saying that, well, this is when your sexual orientation is, so this is the script you have to follow. Once we recognize that these scripts exist, we can work on rewriting them, because that's how we're going to start to create those changes and potentially protect victims from having that secondary harm happen.
Exactly.
And if you think we can't rewrite that script, we can. Humans have been doing it for centuries. If you just look back through history and look at the different beauty standards that have come across, if you look at the different um, cultural standards of beauty, like, and I don't know why I picked beauty standards as like the thing I was going off of here, but every culture, every generation, every century is in some way rewriting that script. Yes, it's all been heavily influenced by what's been happening before, but we have the power to rewrite it if we all just try.
Absolutely. No, I think beauty is actually a great lens to look at this through because of how radically it's changed throughout the years and is still changing, right? Look, heck, I live in Brooklyn. I can't keep up with the trends half the time. Like, it's an ever going conversation. And so when we realize the power that we do hold and that it isn't speaking up, it's in representation, and it's in acknowledging this framework that is not strictly imposed for life. This is not chronic. We have the power to speak up and change this. And that's the first step to creating cultural change.
And you might actually be able to speak a little bit on this too, Aubrey, with your like political background stuff. But it's when we think about rewriting these scripts, it's like who is getting to rewrite them? Who is the ones who are going to dictate it? And what you typically see throughout history is those who have the political power are going to work to write the script to make sure that they can maintain that power over groups of people.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. And that is the unfortunate part that often keeps people silenced. I'm not going to sugarcoat it, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because we think, and we can apply this to so many political aspects, which we do not have time for in this lovely hour-long conversation that we're having, right? But within this context, it's often that pull between, well, what good can I do? Because I am not the big guy in the position of power. And so if I am not writing the laws or I do not have a huge platform, at the end of the day, what good does my voice do? And so I think something that at least is gaining a lot of attention in the circles that I'm in and where I'm seeing when it comes to trauma-informed psychology and conversations around how we care from each other, that there's a huge role of community in this. Because healing doesn't happen in isolation, it happens in relationship, right? And we can also build that through communities of care that can reflect back to ourselves with nuance and love. And one of the most damaging myths of trauma, or even in this exact conversation of who gets to rewrite those narratives, is that it's something that we have to overcome alone. And that feeling of powerlessness is not something that we have to identify with. It's a product of individualism, because I mean, three of us were in America listening to, or, you know, having this conversation right now, but that's also something that we can apply to a lot of cultures worldwide. And community offers something else, where it's witnessing, it's mirroring, it's co-regulation, it's collective reimagining. And there is so much unnamed power in that. And in community, we can start to see those scripts more clearly because others have helped name what we have normalized. Even in this conversation, I'm already feeling so much more empowered just talking to the two of you about this. And when in community, we can try on those new scripts without feeling like it's something too out there or radical, because we're being seen. We're in conversation and being held by the other. And so it's a way of practicing becoming more expansive. And something we talk about in trauma theory a lot is what was harmed in relationship must be healed in relationship, and community makes that possible. So it's having these conversations among those with those you feel safe that can really be the first step.
And relationship doesn't have to mean that like you have to heal this through a romantic relationship
Exactly.
partner. This whole community is a relationship, and that's something I'm always trying to get through to the kiddos that I talk to, is that they're like, "Well, I'm not in a relationship, so I don't need to know this stuff." It's like, but you are. You're in relationships all around you
Yeah.
every day, just not romantic.
Exactly.
Yeah. And you can kind of start seeing some of these, like those community scripts specifically looking a little bit different than like the societal level scripts, like seeing how these like kind of like you have a different script based on like where you're at and who you're with. And how they can really start to kind of affect that change is, and just using me and my friends as an example, it's really fun seeing my friends and I, as we have gotten older, feeling more comfortable opening up and communicating and kind of having similar conversations to like this that I know is really rare, especially like amongst men, where it's like knowing that men have been given the script, we're supposed to be really stoic. We can't express our emotions. We can't cry. We can't be vulnerable. So really seeing that start to play out with my friends, where we do feel more comfortable being vulnerable and open with each other, to see that script start to shift a little bit to where I am more willing to have these conversations with my friends, but also just other people in general.
Yeah.
And focusing on that relational aspect of it is one of the real ways that we can start to see that cultural shift, where it's like you said, Aubrey, it's like, I'm one person. How can I really make a change? What can my voice really do? but it's your voice can impact the few people that you have around you, and those few people then can also impact the people around them.
Yep. And you never know how profound of a change you can make. Even in one person's life, you might be able to change their trajectory, their mindset through just starting the conversation or planting a seed. And that goes out into the connections they have, and then those connections, and it continues to spread. And so I think we can't forget the importance of starting on that micro level and rooting things in community.
Yeah, and that can be something too for like the preventionists out there who are listening, who are doing like, especially like for me and Amanda, where we do obviously prevention work around domestic and sexual violence and human trafficking. Obviously, like we have to affect the societal level if we want to see like profound long-term change, right? Like the laws that are put in place, the policies that are there, the messaging that we get from the most powerful people, that is essentially going to dictate like the prevention messaging and how we can actually see that shift. But we have to start also on that lower level, quote unquote lower level, with the relationships of the people among us, because we need to be impacting every level of that. So like community, relational, political, like, but we're one person, or we're often just a few people. So the more people that we have advocating for what we are saying from that relational level really helps us to start moving to impact that community level, starts impacting that national level, impacting those higher level things, because we have larger and louder voices coming from those like quote unquote like lower levels.
And the more that you talk about these things with your smaller groups, the more you're giving them the space to develop the vocabulary to talk about it to others. Because I know a lot of people who they probably feel similarly to how I do about a lot of these things, but they
Right.
don't know how to voice it. They don't know how to, they don't know the words to use, and they don't want to sound foolish. So instead of saying something, they'll hold back just because they don't know how to start the conversation. And so the more you do, you're teaching them how to start those conversations. You're giving them the words to use, and some of those vocabulary words like cultural script that they've maybe never heard of before. And then they can explain that to someone else. And it's just this big snowball effect where we can all just start feeling more comfortable having these conversations.
Mm-hmm.
So we kind of hit on it a little bit here and there, like talking about like gender, obviously, but really these play out in a bunch of different facets other than just like our gender identity when it comes to how these cultural scripts are playing out just on a regular day-to-day basis. So to really kind of help people understand like what some scripts we may be following, what are some of those scripts that just play out kind of on a day-to-day basis?
Totally. There's such power in naming them, right? Acknowledging them is step one. And all of the examples that I can and will give you they're all really centered around how they're a response to each other's vulnerability and what that looks like and what's allowed. So vulnerability is typically the central context of this all. It can be seen a lot in who's expected to initiate the emotional labor and who's expected to apologize first, and even in whose pain gets centered. So, for example, after, let's say, there's a rupture in a heterosexual relationship, you might see a woman more likely to push for repair or emotional processing or relational attunement because that's what she has been taught to do. Her script says connection is her responsibility. Meanwhile, the male partner might, shut down, get defensive, not at all because he doesn't care, but because his script, when he has inherited societally, tells him that his vulnerability shows up as weakness. And then we can talk about queer relationships too. The scripts, they shift, but they don't disappear. Power still flows through that relational field. And people still absorb messages about how they're supposed to behave based on race, on gender, on trauma history, social roles. All of these things contribute to that conversation on how vulnerability is allowed to be shown and received. And so these scripts, they're not just shaping behavior, they also shape perception. So how we are seeing the vulnerability in the other. And they can dictate who we empathize with and who we are really able to connect with and in what way. And so, unless we're bringing them into awareness, they can quietly corrode that potential for mutual safety and repair, even if people have the best intentions at heart and want to get to the root of the problem without naming or acknowledging these cultural scripts that are in place. It can put up a wall that blocks that process.
And I like the framing it from that vulnerability perspective because it really helps people kind of get a better understanding specifically about how they've been following the script and why, right? Like, well, yeah, as a dude, of course, I've received that messaging like I'm supposed to be the one that just it doesn't really express any of those emotions, right? So when there's an argument or any potential disagreement or conflict in my relationship, well, yeah, of course, I don't have the tools available to me to be able to function in any other capacity except for following the script of potentially being angry or just kind of ignoring the issue. So it can help people also understand when there are these conflicts. Well, if I understand what this script is and I understand what mine and this person's script they've been given, I can start to better understand why they are responding in the way that they are, to be able to better help them then to be able to resolve this conflict in that moment.
Exactly.
And we're talking quite a bit about how we perceive ourselves with these cultural scripts. This is how I'm supposed to act. But it works the same way when we're talking about someone else as well. So if I am following this cultural script that I should act this way and that you should act that way, then that's the behavior that I am either expecting or encouraging you to then also play out. So if I'm encouraging my male partner to have this big, bad, tough, whatever exterior, then it's honestly no surprise when that's what comes back at me as well. And maybe that's not something that I wanted in this relationship, but the it's the behavior I've encouraged throughout the time. So if I'm not going to leave space for them to try and break their own cultural script in maybe some areas that I didn't appreciate, then how can it work both ways into areas that I do appreciate it?
And
I don't know if that made any sense. I kind of started rambling there for a minute.
no, it gave me a really good example to kind of think like show this from like a different relational aspect, right? Instead of like on the confines of a dating relationship, but like think about it when you go to like a grocery store, right? And you're checking out. You have an expectation for what the person who is scanning and bagging your groceries to do and act like, right? You're expecting them, hello, how are you? You're expecting this person to be very kind to you. And even if you are angry with the cashier, you do not allow for them to be angry back at you. Like, we understand or have been told how a cashier is supposed to act and behave, so we are expecting that from them when we go there.
Mm-hmm. Okay, I'm about to throw some scrumptious philosophy stuff at you, but I think it breaks down on such a human level, so I'm throwing it in here. One of my favorite philosophers, Martin Buber, has this concept that everything relationally, we relate to people and it can be objects through I, it, or I, thou. I, it is exactly what you just described. It is, you are my barista, you are my boss, you are my romantic partner, you are my, fill in the blank, a title that we expect someone to hold. And when you're relating to someone through I, it, you inherently place a list of expectations on how you think they are going to respond to you in whatever moment based on that dynamic that you have with them. Then he says there's a connection of I, thou. And when you're relating to someone through I, thou, that is a connection purely of presence. It is taking someone in on that moment without expectations or checklists of what this person has to do for me, but it is pure relation. And to Buber, there was a spiritual component to this. He says this is as close as you are going to get with a connection with the divine, is when you're able to relate to someone through that context of I, thou, of just seeing them as an individual and relating to them in that moment. And so it's about thinking of those relationships of what are the expectations that we placed on them and why are these serving us? I'm not saying that you shouldn't have basic standards for how friends, partners, yada, yada, yada treat you, make sure you're taking out the trash equally. But at the end of the day, when we are relating to people, I think it's so beautiful to keep that concept in mind of saying, I see you and how I'm authentically responding to you in that moment while still keeping in touch with my needs and what I need in that moment. But how can we authentically relate here? And that's that I thou connection.
Yeah, and really using that to think about just even some of the interactions that I have on like a regular or day-to-day basis, right? Like I go and get coffee every week on Saturday from the same place. Granted, I don't remember a lot of the baristas' names because I'm awful with names. It's literally a curse for me at this point, I'm pretty sure. I remember all their faces though. They all know me. We have conversations, like genuine conversations to where like I feel like even though I don't hang out with these people, I do kind of know them. They feel the same way, considering there was like a good like 2-week or 3-week period where they didn't see me, and they're like, oh, we thought something happened to you, we were concerned. Like, we can build these relationships with people by just interacting with them instead of trying to place them in this like easy to follow script for us, because we're just trying to navigate our day-to-day lives and just get through what we can get through.
Exactly. It's so important.
There's a lot of beauty in that I see you, I hear you relationships. Like, I'm not expecting certain behaviors out of you, and I'm not expecting you to fulfill certain things for me. It's just you are you as an individual, and I am appreciating that in your presence. And I think it's just, like it's the most beautiful relationship that you can have with a person. And I love that who's the philosopher you just said?
Martin Buber.
I love that he said that this is as close as you can get to the divine, because I mean, there's a lot of people who maybe aren't religious, maybe have a little bit more spirituality side, or just don't, you know, follow those scripts at all, but they can still feel that beauty in those relationships.
I also hate that I'm terrible with names, but because I also have an 8th grade boy's brain, I remembered the philosopher's last name specifically. I hate it. I hate that that's how that worked for me.
It's tough, but it
Oh
will serve you
man.
well someday on Jeopardy.
Yep. They're just gonna ask for like, oh, who's the philosopher who some random thing. And Sean's brain is just gonna shut down. He's gonna be the only philosopher I ever remembered in life was the Boober guy.
Was the Buber guy.
It's him. It's Boober. I can't wait to be in trivia somewhere. It's a running joke with my friends in trivia because our friend Taylor, she'll know that the most random ass shit, and we're like, we never believe her because like that's crazy. There's no way that's a thing, and she'll be right most of the time. So I can't wait for it to be in trivia. Like his name's Boober, and someone's gonna be like, that's not it. That you're making that up.
You'll get him. You will get him someday.
And then I'll be wrong because my friends won't use that as the trivia answer, and we still won't get the point.
Yeah, but then you can teach them about I, it, and I, thou. So you might lose in trivia, but are you kind of winning in life?
That's
Ah,
true.
see, nice.
That is very true. So this really kind of does lead into a really good transition
Do 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 do
to
do.
because talking about that like I thou or building that relation and actually seeing somebody starts to obviously break down some of those scripts, which is kind of what we need to do when we are working with people who have been hurt. Because if we're not doing that, we're expecting people to have who have been hurt to hurt in a specific way or to not hurt in a specific way. So how do these scripts start to kind of dictate that?
Yeah, great question. So when we're talking about what these scripts mean and dictating exactly that, but also what it means to build back from that, it's about looking at how we can go off script, right? That's the first step. We've acknowledged it. Woo, good on us. Okay, now what does it look like to actually take a turn from that? And it all starts with honest noticing. So, what do I do because I want to? And what do I do because it has been expected of me? And so a lot of the work that I'm doing has a somatic, a body-based component to it, and what it actually means to listen to our bodies and the signals coming up in it. And so the nervous system is often the first place where these scripts show up. So those moments when you feel tension or a shutdown or even a need to perform, which with this awareness that we now all have, we can say, hey, maybe that's because of a cultural script I've inherited. There's probably a script going on and at work there, right? So going off script doesn't mean rejecting everything. If you want to reject everything, more power to you. But like I said at the beginning of this, we live in a society. We need a little like star glitzy sound effect from that.
Yeah.
But it means choosing these scenarios with awareness, right? And in healing work, that means honoring the pace, the form, and the expression that actually work for you. There is not a one size fits all approach for this. And so, with that, people might heal through storytelling, others might through movement or ritual or something that works for them, and some through rupture and repair. There's a process that fits every individual person, and there's no one size fits all prescription that you can put on that. So, when we allow and make space for that plurality, when we say, healing doesn't have to look one way, we start to dismantle those cultural norms and the silence and that silence and shame survivors. And that is the root of real freedom because it invites autonomy and choice back into the conversation.
I love this because, we're taught, these are the stages of grief and these are the stages of healing. And this is the path you have to take to reach enlightenment at the end of the road or whatever. But we're not all following that same path. We've got side quests that are happening along the way and we've got different things that are going on. And people who aren't healing in that way that's expected of them don't get the support that they need to continue their healing because, well, we tried and you're just not doing your part, right? We hear that all the time. Like, you need to try harder. And really, it's just the fact that I'm doing it a little bit different and I need support in a little bit different way. And I think this is a big shift that we could do as a society to help those survivors who don't fit that perfect circle, right? We've got to accept and understand that everyone is different and everyone's going to feel it different and everyone's going to go through it different. And just because I want to make horribly morbid jokes about my dead parents does not mean that I am not grieving or healing in the right way.
Exactly. Honestly, I love the way you phrased all of that so much because it's so real, right? Like, let's start making these conversations real. Grief is not linear. And the fact that there have been so many attempts to, compartmentalize these certain stages, which of course there are stages to grief, but you bop around them, right?
Mhm.
And there is no one size fits all. And you so beautifully put it on how, listening to the body, what is it that you are feeling? And there's a term for this. It's called affect theory. It's the language that we use to describe what I like to call the invisible residue of the experiences that you have. So it can be how emotion either moves through the body or how feeling is shaped by context, by culture. And so in the context of if we're looking at this through, gender or survivorship, this is critical because we have this cultural context of who is allowed to feel certain things and whose pain that someone is very much feeling can be dismissed as, irrational or hysterical or threatening. And so then there are the confines on these emotional norms that are very, very real. So they become internalized and then they result in people questioning their experience because, oh, they don't know, does this count? This doesn't match the expected narrative that I have grown up with and lived with for so long. And so it's not just about discharging emotion, it's about realizing how that emotion is received and how it lives in the body. And so the work becomes not just naming emotion, because oftentimes we feel things somatically in through our bodies long before we can even cognitively process it. It's just that internal feeling that something isn't right here. And sometimes that's even hard to name. You just have that sense in yourself. And it comes down to trusting our intuition, which can be so hard when we have all this cultural crap forced on us, right?
Mhm.
But by having these conversations and starting to break through that, we're making space for that physicality, that truth that comes through the body in all of its mess and all of its complexity. Because there is no script for healing. If you get one thing from this episode, let it be that.
Yeah.
But there is always a need to be felt and witnessed and held, and everyone is deserving of that.
And
When I
as
oh,
oh,
go ahead.
just say, as you were talking, Aubrey, it just made me think too of like some of the scripts that people often may be able to more tangibly understand and how that plays out. It's like women who are often disregarded when they go to a doctor because they have some kind of pain and they just chalk it up to be something else, right? Or where men aren't identifying as victims of domestic violence because we are told all the time that it is women who are experiencing this and it's men who are the perpetrators, which, yes, that is the primary way it plays out, obviously. But if the only script that we allow for is men being abusive to women, if I am a man who has experienced abuse at the hands of a woman, this is something else now. And I don't have the ability to talk about that because my script has told me I have to be strong, I can't be weak. And there's no script for me as a guy to talk about my abuse.
Yep, exactly.
And one of the things that how these can also work for us too is we talked about how we allow for people to be hurt and how we also then see it playing out is I talk about this all the time in my human trafficking presentations because it's really hard for people to understand why victims may go back. Well, if we're not addressing obviously the underlying reasons on why they were victims in the first place, obviously, yes, the odds of them going back are pretty high. But what ends up happening then is we are now given the script to say, we tried to help you. You went back. So now this is on you. We have a script that has been given to us when we see victims who, quote unquote, fail to follow through with what the expectation is supposed to be once someone has left the abuse. So then we chalk it up to them not actually wanting to get out, not actually wanting to have that change for themselves. And then we as a society are reinforcing that for that victim and no longer giving them a space for them to be able to leave when the time comes for them to want to try and leave again, because now they think no one is going to be able to help them.
Yep. I say this so often. We do not leave enough space for messy truth. There are so many, life can throw so many things at you, right? And survivors often carry not just the trauma of what happened, but also the shame of how they're expected to talk about it or not talk about it or respond or react. And there are so many layers to this of the survivor, of the people helping, of the layers that go into this are robust, right? And we've talked about these cultural scripts. We have this imposed on all of us on don't make other people uncomfortable and suppress your own needs for that. But as we've talked about, trauma isn't linear, it's cyclical, it's fragmented, it's often deeply embodied. And it can often show up in really unexpected triggers or in nervous system dysregulation or in patterns that don't make rational sense. And if you're listening to this, I'm putting big old air quotes around rational because there is no rational, okay? How you heal is how you heal, and there is not a script for that. And so when survivors try to speak from that place and they're met with minimization or moral policing or, hey, your response doesn't make sense according to our societally imposed cultural script. Well, hey, what are they going to do? They're probably going to stop speaking altogether.
Mm-hmm.
Or they're going to be forced to contort their stories to a narrative that's supposed to be more palatable or easy to hear. Again, comfort of others prioritized above our own. And so what gets really lost in that process is authenticity. And at the end of the day, healing requires truth. And so I am huge on this idea of messy truth, not just these overly sanitized disclosures, but what is the full complexity of what that harm actually entailed, the degree that someone feels compelled to speak about it, and to try to make sense of that harm in a world that, for being frank about it, often prefers silence.
So, my advice to the people listening is to be messy and to let your friends be messy when they're talking to you and let your family be messy when they're talking to you. One of the things that I always try and uh, teach people who are new to working in the field or new to volunteering in the field, things like that, is that people are allowed to feel however they feel about it. If you are mad that you were sexually assaulted, be mad. If you are sad about it, be sad. If you don't know what the hell to feel because you are just up in the air and all over the place right now, then baby, that's how you're supposed to feel right now. And you need to own it and let it work its way through you. When you try and force yourself into this is how I'm supposed to feel about what happened, then you're losing that bit of yourself and it's not going to heal right.
Yeah, that is so important and that is so powerful.
Yeah.
Because go ahead, Sean.
No, go.
At the end of the day, when we are talking about safety and those, in those conversations are likely wanting everyone to get to a place of relational safety when speaking about those experiences. They likely have good intentions, but in how we are conditioned and yada, 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 other things can unfortunately happen, right? It's the power to be able to bring one's full self into connection without the fear of being shamed or punished or abandoned. And this is how we co-regulate our nervous systems. Social baseline theory says we are based in our emotional environment on who is around us. We are relational creatures. And so it's that mutual responsiveness, it's the co-created repair that has to be present. And people work at their own pace. So the only way to rebuild that relational safety individually and through the collective is through slow, sustained acts of presence and accountability. And I love what you said, how you emphasize that be messy, because oftentimes it is messy. And I want us all to start owning that and accepting that. And let's make that the norm because there is so much power in that.
Yeah. And it's one of the main reasons why whenever a survivor comes onto our podcast to talk about their story and share it, and they ever ask, like, is there something you don't want me to talk about? I was like, this is your story. Tell it how you want it to be told. Who am I to dictate how you can share your story and what you can and cannot say about it? And for those listening who work in the field, that should really be the standard on how we have survivors who want to share their stories. Because if at any point you're saying, oh, you can't say this while you're talking about it, you're dictating what that survivor can and cannot say. You're telling them how they need to then share their story. And if you're one of the ones that I feel like I run into a lot with survivors is like, oh, I've been told like I can't cuss while I say it. I'm like, swear the fuck you want. Like that might be helpful to you in that moment because that helps you get through it and really lets kind of show how you are feeling about what you are sharing. But also, they're just fucking words. So share your story how you want, and please let your survivors share their story how they want, because if they're coming to you for services and they want to share their story at an event that you're hosting, and you then tell that survivor what they can and cannot share on that stage, you are still working to silence your victim.
Yep. And if there are people who are now uncomfortable because of the story that they heard, then that's on them. They need to hear those things to make them uncomfortable. We don't grow in comfort. We grow in an uncomfortable world. And if you can make me uncomfortable by telling me your story, then that's something that I'm going to be able to grow into.
And something you probably needed to hear.
Yeah. Oh, this was so good, guys.
So if we're looking at, because obviously like we want to make sure that people are able to share their stories, talk about their experiences, and feel comfortable doing so. But for a lot of people, starting to go quote unquote off script can be really challenging or scary to really do, especially if the family they are in, the friend group that they're in, the community that they're a part of holds these scripts in very high regard. So, how do we work then towards feeling more comfortable going off script and helping others feel more comfortable allowing for and creating space for people to go off script?
Absolutely. It starts by finding those communities of safety and realizing this is a person with whom I feel like I can share my messy truth. And it might not be the person that you're expecting, right? Oftentimes it can be difficult, especially within, a family context or someone who's incredibly close to you, where those scripts might be long withheld and lasting throughout the entire duration that you've known them. And so it's finding those people that you can start to tell your story. And what does that look like? And figuring out, okay, I feel safe within this connection. How does this feel within my body? How does it feel to tell my story in this way? And starting to connect with that. Because when someone has experienced trauma, especially if it's interpersonal, development, whatever it might be, their nervous system becomes primed to expect threat in relational spaces, which makes so much sense. Our bodies are wired to protect us, right?
Yeah.
So a lot of things can feel incredibly dysregulating. And so it's about finding those points through connection, through community, where you can start that slow but steady process of relational healing. And as we've said, I think it's so important to emphasize this does not have to be a romantic partner. We are all in relationship, regardless of your, quote unquote relationship status. No, we are all in relationship with each other. So, what does that look like to find those communities of care and starting to build a new relational rhythm within which you can feel safe that teaches the body this doesn't have to be a state of danger. I can embrace my messy truth and I can be my full self here.
And I think remembering that slow and steady part is like really important too, because when we want to change things, like, yes, we want to see the change like right now, but change takes time. And if you are someone who's like listening to this episode and you're like doing all this work on understanding cultural scripts, and now you want to have this conversation with your friends to change that situation or to change the scripts that your friends are following or your family or your partner or whoever it is, they're not in the same place as you right now. And you have to recognize that and try to start meeting them where they're at to help them catch up. You've done a lot of the work. They may not have. So meeting them where they're at to help them come along with you instead of, okay, I tried with this person, they didn't want to hear it, so I'm going to try somewhere else. Because they might want to, but they're not in the same spot.
Oh, Sean, that is so important and such a good point, and something that I have learned not through my formal academic studies, but in life. That people, we are all coming to each other with I like to call it a certain little toolkit within those of the elements that we have been taught about self-regulation and the tools, the awareness that we bring into our everyday connection. And the key is realizing that not all toolkits are built the same. It doesn't make anyone better than another. It just simply means we are all coming into this with a certain set of knowledge. And we are all in different places in our learning journeys, what we're trying to get out of connection and how we ultimately connect with each other, right? So if there's anything that I would love people to walk away with today, it's knowing that you have permission. You have permission to ask different questions about pain than the ones you've been taught. You have permission to slow down, listen to your body, and you have permission to rewrite narratives that no longer serve you. Even before you get into that conversation with others, it can start on an individual level, even if those narratives came from family or culture or the systems that we have been taught are sacred and cannot be messed with. And I want people to know healing is not linear. It is not neat or nicely packaged. And whatever you have carried with you, you are not alone because there are other people building new scripts too. You got 3 of them right here. And we are ultimately doing it together, no matter where you're meeting people in their journeys.
I also want to just tell people you can have more than one group of friends. You can have different groups of friends that meet your different needs. And just because these are the people that I have known for the last 20 years and we are the best of friends, doesn't mean that I can't have another group that I can go to with some other things. And In my experience, find yourself a group of LGBTQIA friends. If you don't already have them, find them because they are used to not living in those cultural norm scripts and they're not going to look at you differently because you are trying to challenge them as well. I have never had more honest, open conversations about messy things in life than I have with my LGBTQIA friends.
Yeah, it's also just keeping in mind like have diverse people, like diverse groups of people you hang out with. Like if your whole friend group looks like you, maybe also find additional friends too. Like not new friends and just forget those ones, but like have some
Branch out.
diversity.
You're not going to
Diversity is the
see
spice of
new
life.
ways of life if you're just surrounded by the same all day, every day. Everybody should just get a little culture. And I know there are a lot of places in America where that is really hard to do because we have small rural areas who have been living the same cultural norm for the last 100 years, but you can find them. Trust me, you can. You just have to look and you have to be open to it, and you can create it yourself.
Yeah. And that can even be a way you start changing some of that script too, because that's the expectation. Well, thank you so much for joining us today, Aubrey. This has been an incredible conversation. We are so glad to have had you on today. But before we sign out, do you have any last thing you want to make sure our audience takes away from this?
Be messy, y'all. At the end of the day, embrace how you want to tell your story and how you want to change these cultural norms. And honestly, I am feeling so lit up and inspired after this conversation. And this was just 60 minutes of us talking. And we are people in this field. We do this stuff every day. And I feel like I'm ready to take on the world after this. This is super exciting and invigorating to me. And I encourage all listeners to find that fire within them in a way that serves you. There is no one size fits all, there is no one script. But if this resonates with you, I encourage you to really tap into that and explore that. And together, the more we start having these conversations, I really do think we're on the path to societal change.
And if they want to find you anywhere on social media, where can they find you?
Please do find me. I'm on Instagram at Aubrey__Aust. Head to my website, www.aubreyAust.com. Sign up for my monthly newsletter. I publish relational psychology and philosophy updates. You can stay updated on my research there. I'm also on LinkedIn, but that's kind of corporate and boring, but I do post really good nuggets up on there. So would love to see you around. Please connect and always more than happy to chat.
Awesome. And I'll make sure I have links to all those in the show notes as well. And then if someone listening wants to continue to do some of this work, obviously following you and going to your website would be a great place to start. But do you have any other resources you think would be helpful to them?
Absolutely. Yeah. So I am regularly publishing things on my website. I would also encourage them to start to explore trauma-informed psychology. There are a lot of things within this field. I'm more along the lines of relational psychology, how we heal in relationship. Huge fan of Esther Perel, and follow closely along with her work, but really starting to explore what it looks like to heal relationally. And just if some of these terms seemed big and scary that you heard today, go down the Google rabbit hole because that is where I started. And now I'm fully down the rabbit hole. So I encourage you to explore that too.
Awesome. Well, thank you again so much for joining us today, Aubrey.
Thank you. It's been a pure pleasure. Hope to connect with you both more soon.
Yes. Hopefully we can get you back for another one.
I would love it.
Awesome. That's what we like to hear. Well, thanks again, Aubrey. And thank you all for listening today. Please follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and Threads at TouchySubsPod to keep up to date when we have new episodes and other content coming out. Please email us any questions, comments, or concerns to touchysubjectspodcast@gmail.com. And please rate and follow us on your favorite podcast listening app. It really helps the show out.
And in the meantime, don't be afraid to challenge, ask, and discuss when it comes to touchy subjects.